Wait for a second. It's loading up.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the July Ealing Schools Forum. It's nice to see you all as the term comes to an end. And I think we'll kick off the meeting promptly by starting with apologies for absences and substitutions. Thanks, Cornelia.
Good evening. We have apologies for absence from Robert South, who is a strategic director, from Reverend Pete Broadbent in the VA and Faith Ethos Academy category, from Tony George and Kimberly Herring in the Academy category, and from Mia Pai in the High Schools category, and from Dave Woods as well in the Primary category. Okay, thank you. And Roisin Walsh is running late. Thank you.
Sorry, Jeremy, I was going to ask you to quieten down the forces behind it, but I think they have quietened down a bit. Okay. Urgent matters. I presume there's no urgent matters. Matters to be considered in private. None. Declarations of interest. The minutes from the last meeting on the 18th of July, 18th of April. So page 3, page 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Any comments? Okay, so we agree the minutes. The minutes for the last meeting are agreed. So membership, so just to bring this to forum's attention, that we have an unusually high number of vacancies arising in September. I would ask that colleague heads and governors contact their networks, keep this issue as high profile as possible. Sort of time slips by and suddenly we're at the November forum and we're not in any way prepared for it with our membership. So Cornelia and her colleagues will obviously issue notifications and election forms, and that will go out through gatekeeping. But if we could really just keep this on any agenda. Otherwise, it's going to be myself and Cornelia at the Skills Forum. And we might invite tomorrow. And one of those member vacancies is Dave. Oh yes, Dave Wood has resigned his membership from today. Dave has got a lot of commitments through his work through the NIHC and understandably has not been able to make meetings. So I just wanted to record my thanks for Dave's many years of contribution and support to Schools Forum. He really has been a great support to Ealing Schools Forum. So if we could just record our thanks to Dave. Okay, so over to the main body of the report. The majority of items are for noting, and I think there's only one item for agreement, but I'll hand it over to Kim.
Thank you, Paul. 2 items for agreement, actually, but yes, a lot other items for noting. Okay, hi colleagues. So the purpose of the June normally, July this time report is to provide an update on the outturn position for the local authorities maintained schools and the dedicated school grant, highlight issues relating to funding that the forum will need to, and highlight issues related to funding that the forum needs to consider as part of the early years, high needs schools and central school services budgets for this year and next.
Kim, many apologies, but procedurally, I think I should have had Mike first.
Sorry, well, yeah, fine.
Otherwise, Mike's going to have to wait for the whole of the report to go through.
No, that's fine. We're going to, I'll hand over to Mike. Yeah, no, that's fine. So that was the purpose of the report. So the first recommendation and something that we bring to this meeting of the forum is an update from the AD for audit investigation. So I'll hand over to Mike to do that update first.
Thank you. I was quite happy to, honestly. So here's my annual audit nag, as I've come to call it. But I'm trying to keep the nag down to the minimum and highlight some of the stuff that we have been finding, just to help with an awareness. And in terms of recruiting other members, what better thing than an annual nag from the head of audit to whet their appetite. I'm as introduced, the Assistant Director for Audit Investigations. We're a shared service with between Ealing and Hounslow, so we audit all of the schools we audit all of the schools in Ealing and Hounslow. So these are findings across each of the schools. I'm going to talk to you about the audits, what we're finding, and a couple of fraud risks where we've had real frauds, and just so you're kind of aware of those and can think about mitigations and what suits you. I'd also like to introduce Michelle Woodhatch, who is the new Deputy Head of Audit. She's going to be leading on the delivery of audits, so you'll be going to her instead of me on future audit delivery. She's sitting in the cheap seats for now, away from the spotlights. So in terms of 2024 audits, we introduced much shorter audits, very much SFBF based, but the finance stuff and stuff that we generally found wasn't being done in schools previously, so we kind of focused towards the problems. 7 short audits. We did 2 full audits where previous years had nil assurances to go back and see what had been done. The next page shows you the kind of highlights. Paul's particular favourite, this one, I know, purchase orders, and 100% of schools aren't doing it. And I think, as I've said in the past, it's about setting de minimis levels, agreeing that with your board of governors, and people still aren't doing that. So you might want to think about having a conversation, and governors having a conversation to say, what are we doing, what aren't we doing, why aren't we doing it, what are we doing? And I think it's about commitments, it's about preventing fraud, all the things I've told you in previous years, and just thinking about those. I know you've got a million other things to do. I'm not saying you need to do a purchase order for your milk delivery. It's kind of where you should do that, but also talking to your governors about what we are doing and what we're not doing and what is reasonable. Reconciliations of banking and card purchases, just making sure that they're seen, signed off, that stuff isn't going through your bank account. You've not had a fraud committed that isn't picked up if it's not done regularly. If you're still using checks, unfortunately, people add a few zeros and bank them, and that gets easier and easier. But just looking at those things, trying to make sure they're done regularly, making sure that card use is appropriate, and ensuring that sign off is done by people other than the people who are using the cards. It sounds fairly basic. That links into the expenses stuff, where 57% of schools had recommendations about kind of sign-offs. Ensuring receipts are legible so you can claim the tax back and those kind of things. Just a reminder on those, and 14% of schools, so still reasonably high but getting better. Just making sure your voluntary accounts are reviewed and discussed with the governors. Sorry, that's nag over. Into kind of a couple of fraud risks. So we had an incident at one of the schools where an individual's account was hacked. They set, so their email account was hacked. In doing that, they identified that they could log on to their payroll. They logged onto their payroll and they changed the bank account details, and that person's pay got diverted to a fraudster. So they didn't get paid that month. From your own school's point of view, I know that you're kind of responsible for ICT controls. Do you have what's called multi-factor authentication? So if you're not aware what that is, you know that really annoying thing where it sends you a text number to your phone and you have to type it in. Actually, that is one of the best controls for stopping fraudsters. When kind of you're thinking about, do I want that really annoying thing where I'm typing that number in and stuff, think about that as to, do you want your pay to go into your bank, or do you want it to go into somebody else's bank, or would you rather use multi-factor authentication or not? It's one of those things that yeah, like I say, is really annoying, but is a good control and will mitigate in a lot of those type of attacks.
Sorry, Mike, can I just ask a question? Did you say that the fraud, that account hack, was a result of an account hack into an email that then give them access into payroll information?
So what had happened was essentially they hacked the person's email account. This was really complicated, and I will say it wasn't in this borough, but that kind of reveals where it was. This was quite an interesting one in that they actually were a school where there was a junior school that was part of the council, and there was a middle school that was an academy, and the academy had one of their service users had an email account on there that they used for their correspondence. That got hacked. From that, they ascertained that the individual used the ESS system, which is the same that we use here at Ealing, and from that they went into the account. They basically reset the individual's password, and then were able to read, obviously, that they'd reset it, go in, change the log-on details, then go in and change the bank details. Yeah, yeah.
Log on to an email account. I've never heard of that.
It's within the council we do it, and I think we're saying, like, because you guys are responsible for your own T, probably have your own for your own IT, not T, for your own IT providers. You want to have a conversation with them about utilising it, because it will mitigate a lot of hacks, because you have that independent number. So it's just adding another layer of.
On that, I wasn't just thinking of a school-wide, everybody logging in their email. Sorry, I'm getting into the practicalities and details of something that requires a separate conversation. I know you're trying to keep, but wonder, is there something that could be issued as?
Yeah, so we've been running cybersecurity drop-in sessions for schools. They're published on EGFL. I think we've run about 3 of them. There's been limited take-up. The presentations from those sessions have been put up on EGFL, so you can see them there. But I think I'd suggest people join those sessions. So our corporate lead for IT and all of our security infrastructure leads those sessions. So a great source of information. And has been directly involved in supporting schools resolve issues around being hacked and various other things. So, and malware. So there is some guidance available, and your
sessions run CyberX.
Oh, there you go. Thanks, Mike. And also your IT providers as part of their regular testing. So there are different levels of testing you can have, but they should be coming back with recommendations which will include things like multi-factor authentication.
Sorry, Mary.
Just wondering about potential costs. So if you've got members of staff who are being required to use a mobile phone, does the school then have to buy the mobile phone? And whether or not that would cause a union issue, Stefan, in terms of requiring staff to access their personal. And I know there's one person in my team who won't use the personal phone for any work devices. So I'm just thinking, in terms of the advice and guidance, whether it could just include the practicalities for us all. And then one other just quick question, whether this presentation could be put in gatekeeping so that we can get it out to everybody, because that would be really useful as well.
There are other ways of doing multi-factor authentication, not just through your phone and a mobile. There's other email accounts that can be sent to one email account. And so even if they haven't got a mobile phone, I'm pretty sure most of my members have got a mobile phone, but for the one or two that choose not to, there are a range, you are given a range of options to authenticate. So another email account is another way of authenticating it. Everyone has more than one email account, work and personal.
It can ring you at home as well. As Tamara points out, and I've tried to link in here, look out on EGFL, and I did speak to the cyber expert in terms of the controls here. Regular patching, which is simply put in terms of asking your provider to make sure that you regularly update the software so you've got the latest versions. As you know, probably from your home PCs, you regularly switch it off and it's like updating, keeping those updates live, because quite often it's security patches that are vulnerabilities on the, and people can find ways in. Do you have cyber awareness training? So I'm a trustee for a multi-academy, and they run cyber awareness training, and I have to do that every year as part of their insurance package. So I think that's through TES, which I know a number of people utilise. But just getting people to look at those annually. The biggest weakness on a lot of these things is individuals clicking on stuff, signing up to stuff, their details, and that provides the that they can get the username and log on from that, which is why the multi-factor authentication just provides an extra layer. There's also guidance there about what the good complex password is. Again, as I say, do try and attend those sessions because people with more expertise than me can help and guide you on that. Second one is just around dual working. We do a match with a national board initiative each year, and it gives us flags where people are doing a job with somewhere else. When we've gone to the school to see if they've declared that, we've had a number of cases where they haven't. It's turned out to be fine, and they just needed to do a declaration. To me, it's just about good management, knowing what your staff are doing, trying to manage those conflicts. Whilst there aren't a massive number of those, it's just about knowing what people are doing. The biggest one is where it turns out the school has a link to it, and they'll around just including players, and it's just having an awareness to those. Most of these things can be managed nicely if you know that these things are there, and just reminding to do that, or if they have a code of conduct of these things, just trying to manage that. It shouldn't be a problem. Most of these are there, but we don't know about. We've had referrals of cases where there's collusion, and if we've not got these pieces of paper, increases the risk and transparency. Just to say, if you do suspect a fraud, do act quickly, try and document what you've got, then report it to us, have a conversation with us. sometimes these things turn out to be nothing, but and through that conversation you can get through. I've given contact details there. Don't try and investigate it yourself. The fraud team are trained in Police and Criminal Evidence Act and do it in a certain way. If you don't investigate it yourself, you might to prosecute the individual. Don't discuss matter with colleagues because they may be involved. Don't approach or accuse anybody. That's the worst thing, in case it turns out to be. Talk to us about involving the police, give you guidance and stuff like that. Unfortunately, this is the police thing. They've got millions of cases. Unfortunately, some fraud cases we can't do anything with because they're quite small, and we've got millions. But do try and have those conversations and contact. I'd say so many of these things turn out to be a thing, and we look at the controls and we look at mitigations and stuff is there and in place. But it's helpful to have those conversations. We aren't the policy setters. The last slide points to some of those. I'd say we get quite a lot of questions about what should I do in these circumstances. A lot of these things are set out within the guidance that's available, and work closely with Tamara and Kim to just kind of they'll talk to us about these policies and kind of things. And if you've got questions about what do I do in these circumstances, what do I do in those circumstances, start with these policies. It should set those out. Obviously, there is always going to be points that aren't covered. Those are the questions that go usually to the finance team, but they'll liaise with us if they want guidance on what we would do in terms of if we found this from it. So just a reminder, those kind of billions of reference points are there for your assistance and what you should be complying to in the audit. Any questions?
Mike, can I ask, with the gifts and hospitalities policy, first of all, how often is that kind of policy reviewed and cross-checked against other similar organizations in the sector, like multi-academy trusts, federations, who often have different standards around these sorts of things, which can sometimes put maintained schools in challenging situations when it comes to recruitment and retention?
I know we looked at it last year. I'm kind of looking over to Kim because, like I say, we don't set them. But we looked at it last year because there was an increasing number of claims that weren't compliant with it. Actually, we also looked at it at Hounslow, and they increased their restrictions on it as a result of that. We are conscious of the sector. We do look at those things. We give our advice. We let the team that set it know if we've got concerns because we're finding it consistently. I mean, there was a lot of wellbeing accounts last year, and some of there was a ambiguity over how much was going into wellbeing accounts between schools. So some of that was tightened up in response to that. So I would say every couple of years, I would say we refresh it, but where we're kind of finding stuff, we're talking regularly to the Sarah team and the accountancy team about our findings and whether we need to tighten it up as a result or actually that. I mean, you'll know from the audit reports what the odd occasion isn't stuff that we tighten down, but we found people going out and spending on Christmas parties and alcohol and stuff like that. It can't be well-being, can it? So it's kind of thinking about those kind of reasonableness and defining what is well-being and trying to tighten those things down. And I would say if you're in doubt, talk to your accountancy team, talk to your bursarial support. Ultimately, come to us. But I think the policies are quite tight. But when people say about kind of the Christmas party, well, my team go out, we all spend their own money on it. That's the kind of generosity. Unfortunately, it's taxpayers' money. Would they really approve of us going out and having a big party, spending their? Unfortunately, the answer is generally no. And what would the Daily Mail say? So there's a there's a test for you. And I think it's just having that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I'm not suggesting that schools should go and be doing some of the things that you're suggesting, but I do think that there is a mismatch between what's happening in the academy sector and what's happening in the maintained sector. And I think that, as recruitment, retention, teacher shortages increase, young teachers, millennial teachers are looking for a very different kind of environment, working environment in education, that with some of the quite strict guidelines in maintained schools is becoming more challenging to follow. And I'm not suggesting we set up beer fridges in the staff rooms or any of that sort of thing, but our politicians, set a bit of a precedent as well. And I just think that perhaps from time to time, if we can compare and contrast our policy with maybe medium to large multi-academy trusts within so many miles, just to see how we compare, because there is a feeling that there is a mismatch between what we can do and what they can do, and I just think it's worth noting.
I think it's a fair point. As I say, we kind of do the assurance to the policy that exists, and we raise that. I think there are certain areas of play where we will talk to the team, and that will sometimes lead to that. But
yes, I think the areas audit are more likely to come back on the areas that need tightening up rather than the other way round, as you would expect. But yeah, no, that's feedback we can take on board and relook at that area.
Could I ask a couple of things, Mike? But one, you talked about obviously fraud. Has there been any example of fraud from within staff within schools, or is it all external and we're protecting the schools against that external fraud? Hoping the answer it's all external, but I'd ask the question.
you'll be disappointed by the answer. There are instances of, and if you go back to my presentation last year, something I can't give a lot of detail on, but there was some examples of internal fraud there that do happen internally here. And when we bang on about purchase orders and bank recs, those are the sort of things that will mitigate some of those things that happen. And to be honest, one of them was picked up by a new head teacher putting in reconciliations. And when we can talk about that one, which will probably be next year's, we will.
Second question, unrelated to fraud. Does the audit investigation team do routine audits of schools that might help to identify? We've had a case where we have a school that has a huge deficit that hasn't become apparent in a short time frame, and I couldn't help wondering whether audit might have been able to look at things like that a little bit earlier. I don't know if that's within the remit of the team, but I said I would ask the question of you again on that one.
Ultimately, we have regular conversations about this. Tamara's smiling because she's. We are an assurance function, so our role is to go around the schools and periodically look at that. There should be elements such as accountancy that pick up these kind of things as they happen, because if we do a point in time, so we could come in today and you're absolutely fine, and then 2 weeks later it's gone horribly wrong, and it's like we've given assurance that it all looks good, and then it suddenly isn't. So that's my kind of reservation. We are there to try and provide assurance around the controls and the control environment working on a normal basis, but it is always limited by a point of time. Hopefully we'd pick up some of those controls, like you're not raising PO, so suddenly all that spend that's coming through as the invoices land and causes a big amount of stuff that's not showing in your budget and your commitments, would come through. So it's kind of alluding to and trying to demonstrate some of those things. But we're only ever sample based. We can't look at everything. You know, we're only looking at certain things, but hopefully the audit process will set out the control framework, look at those key risks, give an indication. We report all our stuff into the education team, Bursarial and accountancy, to try and make sure that it's all linked up. So if there's kind of red flags coming from all angles, we kind of collaborate on those things. And if we haven't looked at a school where they've got concerns for a period of time, we'll try and build that into our future planning. But it's that assurance framework of hitting it at the right time, and also, you know, actually we should be looking at schools, and green can be good as well, and gives the assurance that we don't need to look at those things, and things are working. So it's that balance of things.
Yeah, no, thank you. Hi, I just wanted to check, you mentioned potential check fraud. How many schools are actually still using checks, and do they not have online banking?
I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but we've had some, and we regularly get reports of stuff where, and it's usually now for the bank will deal with it, but a surprising number. But I think we try and encourage people to stop using them. As you know, if you get a check now, you can scan it with your phone. That makes it much easier to change the numbers. So what we regularly find is that people put a couple of more noughts on there, change the provider, scan it in, it goes through. Bank rec is the point where you'll pick up that that's happened. I would say go back and stop using checks if you can, but unfortunately some still do. It's reducing, but even if you've just got your checkbook in the safe, you're creating a risk if somebody could do that. It's very easy to get people's signatures, say scan it into a phone, change a few things, scan it again. What's making our life easier is making the fraudster's life easier as well. So this is why I generally recommend don't use checks, but there are still. If I could, I would. I'd ban all cash as well, to be honest. But you know, we try. Cash is, you know, cash and checks now are the worst things because they're so easy to do it. So if you can move to truly cashless, I mean, I joke with my team. If you go into a school, and you might want to do this where you're a governor or even as a head teacher, go and open the safe, and I will bet you will find a pot of coins that is unlabeled or is from some event or is something sitting in there, and it's every time, because there's always something. And it's always good. It's always a you know, a fate or a something or some reason. But it's like we say we're cashless, but actually we're not. And do just kind of think about those events and whether you can move it to it. That where I'm on a trustee, I'm also a parent to one of the schools, and they told me, the auditors reassured me that it was cashless, and then I went to an event the next day and they were happily taking cash. But actually it exposes those individuals to risks as well. This was an evening function where they then had to take that cash home and all those kind of things. They could have been robbed on the way home for it, they could have lost it, etc., etc. And it's just, actually, I know you get charged for those cash transactions, but think about that, about the time it takes to go to the bank to count it all up, to have two people there to count it all up, and those kind of things. Yeah, so no, absolutely, do please go away and say, are we using cash? Don't. Are we using checks? Don't.
Okay.
And that will be one less finding next year.
Thanks, Mike. I think we're going to have to, there's one more question from Rushing and maybe a quick one from Jim, but we're going to have to draw this conversation to close, or otherwise we're going to be here for a long period of time. Rushing, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Just to note, I would love to know the academy sector that it doesn't have its checks, because I think actually the academy sector has more checks than the maintenance sector. It's actually quite difficult to get some of the stuff through, and we have 4 audits a year. But my question is, Mike, if you thinking about hospitality and supporting staff at the end of a term, etc., and you're not buying alcohol, and your governors agree or your trustees agree to a certain amount of money to be spent, is that acceptable?
I think the gifts and hospitality prohibits as it currently stands. So even with governor approved, the governor shouldn't approve that.
Okay, thank you.
And Jamie, was there a quick question from you?
It may be a slightly facetious point. We're primary schools, and my year 6s the other day wanted to raise some money for Grenada, organised their own bake sale, and raised about £23 or something in cakes that is then getting done to Grenada or sent over to Grenada by my year 6 teacher, who's going to add it up and do a transfer. I get what you're saying about it exposing us to risk. We're teachers, we're in a trusted profession, and we're working with little kids making £23 on a bake sale. I think it's a real impossibility for schools to go completely cashless. I get all the trips and all that kind of stuff. We're cashless on all of that. But if we're doing a bake sale for 23 quid, we're not going to teach the year 6s how to do how to do sum up machines for a little tiny bake sale. And if that gets me in trouble on my audit report, mea culpa. But we want to encourage creativity in our children, who are like between the ages of 3 and 11, and some of that is going to be selling stuff really cheap with real coins.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. I think it's a point well made, and we're going to draw that discussion to a close if that's okay. But I think, Mike, it was just a point that Jamie was making about the reality of day-to-day life in the school. I think not for a moment. We really appreciate what Mike has brought to the table in terms of because it protects us as much as anything else, and I think Jamie's acknowledging that. But the support from Mike and his team is really valuable and invaluable, and it's a great support to School Forum as well. So thanks, Mike.
We wouldn't raise that. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so if I move on to the recommendation 2. So recommendation 2 is to note the level of school balances as well as the loan and deficit agreements in place as at 31st of March. So these are set out, school balances at individual school level are set out in Appendix 3. The vast majority of those are finalised, but there are a couple that are still provisional in there. And then the detail of the section of the report is section 3.2 and 3.1 and 3.2. So the maintained school balances provisionally total just over 14 million, which is a decrease of 3.6 million on the previous year. And the report shows the proportions and numbers that have decreased and increased their balances. So around half of schools have increased their balances in the past year. There's 37% who've decreased their balances, and then we'll get into the schools that are in deficit. So in terms of excess balances, there are 20 schools at the end of this financial year who have excess balances, which is considered to be 8% of or more of the budget for nursery, primary and special schools, and 5% for high schools. And the amounts above the excess threshold total of 4.5 million. So that 20 schools is a decrease from last year. So last year that position was 30 schools and 6.5 million. So that is a decrease in that position from last year. The report then sets out the scheme for financing schools and the clawback mechanism within that, and we'll come to the decision around that shortly. In terms of schools in deficit, there are 12 schools in deficit at the end of the previous financial year, which is a comparison to 11 schools from last year. So there were 2 schools who went from deficit into surplus. So St Anne's and Grove House recovered their deficits and moved back into surplus. 3 schools who reduced their deficit, 6 who increased theirs, and 3 schools who were previously in surplus who are now in deficit this year. Deficits in total amount to around 3 million. And the range is set out in the reports. And the local authority have kind of robust monitoring requirements and offer ongoing support for schools who are in deficit. Schools are required to submit a 3-year plan, which is then risk assessments and followed up with school leaders. We're working closely with those schools who are in a deficit position. Around a third of those have a deficit recovery in place, which shows them recovering that deficit within 3 years and either have or are moving towards having a licence deficit agreed. The other 2/3 of those schools we're continuing to work with around developing that deficit recovery plan. So before we move on to these surplus balances and the clawback, does anyone have any questions or comments around that section?
Hi, Kim.
John?
I'll be in favour that we do apply the clawback again, but I'd also ask whether we can consult on whether we should increase the clawback levels for next year and take a decision at forum coming forward on that early next year.
Yeah, so that was so we did have a question on that in the consultation, schools consultation last year. We can include another question on that. So forum members will remember that the decision of whether to there's a signing off of the clawback mechanism, which happens at the April meeting, and then at this meeting there's a decision on whether to implement that mechanism. But yeah, we can include a question in the consultation about the principles around the mechanism to garner schools' views ahead of making those decisions.
I think more than the principles, which are important, but is it possible to offer a couple of alternatives, practical alternatives? So what the thresholds, a couple of alternate thresholds, because the present arrived at, so I think if there were a couple of practical suggestions that at least would engender discussion, do you understand, get what I mean? Rather than just the principles of clawback or not clawback, it's the thresholds that are the issue, really.
That was the kind of the question I was putting forward, I think, Paul, on that. I think initially we looked at it as signifying that we didn't think that balances should just be increasing or surpluses should just be increasing, but now to look at the thresholds of that, to look at whether it's right to claw back slightly more than that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there is evidence from looking at the balances that the clawback mechanism is having the desired impact, because as I say, the number of schools above that mechanism is reducing. The schools that were subject to clawback last year, not like all of those schools, none of those schools are subject to clawback this year, so have sort of reduced their balances. I think 2 of them are still above the mechanism, but have reduced their balances from the previous year. So there is evidence that the mechanism and having the mechanism in place is working. But yeah, when we did include a question last year about the thresholds, and at the time the view from schools was that the majority of schools was that they were broadly happy with those thresholds. But I think we've had the discussion at previous meetings that the response rate was relatively small on that consultation, and that we want to do what we can to encourage a larger response rate. So yeah, happy to include a question on that again this year to garner more schools' views.
Yeah, I think the issue was that with the £4.5 million you mentioned as the amount over the limit, but only £22,000 being suggested fell under the criteria currently set, means that it feels as though it's quite an ineffective instrument in a way. And picking up your last point, I think that the economic climate alone will probably have done for most of the schools who previously had a bit more money in the kitty than they've got now. So I would expect it to keep moving in that direction, even if they didn't make conscious decisions to avoid being in the top category of excess balances.
Do we know, over the course of the last 3 years, perhaps how many schools have gone up, down, up? Because then it would suggest maybe the mechanism isn't having the desired effect. And I don't disagree with my esteemed colleague over here about schools being under more pressure, but because of the low rate of clawback at thresholds, one might be inclined to, play the game that I'm suggesting might exist.
So I think schools are becoming more familiar with the mechanism, so there is a danger that that will happen. I think ultimately what it's stoked is greater kind of level of understanding and oversight from both governors and school leaders, rather than falling into having a large surplus without really understanding the consequences of that, or having a kind of an outline plan without any genuine commitments or kind of purposeful work to spend that surplus. So there will, whatever mechanism you have in place, if people want to game a system, they'll find a way of gaming it. But I think in gaming it, they will also be spending their surplus. So we can include the question about increasing the percentages and the ranges, and we can come back to a decision and discussion around that.
Yeah, and we can include some information about some sort of context around what you're describing in that question to help with that decision making.
But I guess the issue as a contributing member here that I'd be more concerned with is it's more the unintentionality of the whole issue, that having very excessive balances often creeps up on you if you're not robust in your budget monitoring. And I suppose it's kind of trying to find a way to push that agenda about, and I know there is, but the fact, I think it's the unintentionality of it, that suddenly you're at the end of the financial year, and notwithstanding the drop in of a grant to that really by Christmas, you should really know what your outturn is going to be, to allow you, if it's appropriate to spend money. I mean, you should be spending money just for the sake of it, and I think perhaps a bit more work. I'm not quite sure what the mechanisms for that are, but yeah, because I suspect people aren't, hoarding money.
Yeah, but I think we can take that away and think about it. I think schools tend to be quite cautious in their budget monitoring anyway, so that's always a bit of a risk. And well, potentially both, which sometimes means that there are surprises later on in the year outside of late on allocations. Ultimately the balance control mechanism is kind of a reaction and a response to something having happened, but we've now had quite challenging conversations, meetings, exchanges with about 20 odd schools, 20 to 25 schools over the last 3 or 4 years where we've been doing this, and it has definitely set the tone and the expectation. So I think it has had a shift in terms of people's approach, both governors and school leaders' approach to managing the budget and not retaining excessive surpluses.
So that's good, and I think it's reassuring to hear that, and I think it's an appropriate conversation for School Forum to have, so that we are minded that this is an important issue going forward. So, I think that there is quite a bit of reassurance that this is important to everybody. Jamie?
Just a really minor point on falling roles and classes reducing forms of entry. That changes what 8% means to you. So I think it's important to make that realization that you can't have governing bodies saying, oh, we always keep 300k in reserves, because that might have been 7% of your budget. But if you're dropping a form of entry and you have less pupils in your school, your percentage changes. So you might unintentionally be above 8% by accident because your governors are working on a monetary figure rather than a percentage. So I think that's an important thing that we might need to take back to our schools through quadrants or something, about remembering that it's a percentage, not an actual amount, because that will change.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jamie.
Final point. I'm just so impressed that after 2 or 3 years of real financial pressure, that there are still quite a large number of schools that are able to increase their surpluses year on year. I just wish I had the same skills that they appear to have to deliver that where I need to deliver it.
Yeah, so if I move on to the third recommendation, which is the actual decision around the clawback. So the decision for Forum to make is to agree the proposed plan of action that Forum wishes to take where schools have excess increasing surpluses, including whether to apply the clawback mechanism as recommended in option 1, which is set in 3.3. So last year, the clawback was applied to 3 schools in the end, and that clawback total 313,000, of which a significant proportion from 1 school was actually a contribution to a revenue contribution to capital schemes. For this year, there's potentially 4 schools, so all primary schools, who would be subject to clawback based on 23-24 balances, using the 3-year review period that we that's within our current mechanism. I think important to note that this is the position based on balances before the review of the balance forms. So that position may change, and there may be schools that either come out of that, or the amounts that are illustrated in Appendix 4 reduced based on those review. But the decision for schools forum members is to consider whether to apply option 1, which is to apply the clawback mechanism, resulting in up to around £20,000 clawback. And this is the option that the local authority recommend the forum agree, or option 2 is not to apply the clawback mechanism. So that's a decision for forum to.
So I presume are agreeing. Anybody got any objections? No. Okay, we've agreed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so recommendation 4 of the report is to note the summary of the dedicated school grant funding decisions to be made for the 25-26 financial year, and to provide initial feedback on these services to assist with the local authorities' planning. So this is around the dedelegation, the retained and general duties, historic commitments, and the central schools services block. So the decisions that will come to forum in the November and or the January meeting. So section 3.4 and appendix 5 set out some of the previous agreements and some of the decisions around this. So the school's operational guide for 25-26 hasn't yet been published. It's normally published in sort of early to mid-July. Obviously, we've just had an election, so there may be a slight shift in the timing of that. We haven't got a date for that, but we do expect it to be kind of before the summer. And there's a timetable set out on page 18, which shows the sort of decision-making timetable for that. We're not expecting huge changes in the operational guidance, so we anticipate there'll probably be a small increase in formula factor rates to reflect the sort of pay and inflation pressures, but not expecting any other significant changes. Ealing's funding continued, as you remember, to substantially mirror the national funding formula in 24-25, with sort of some small adjustments to the ARPU rate and to the deprivation and prior attainment factors for affordability, and we anticipate that similar adjustments will be required in 25-26. There's a little bit of detail in there about the premises growth funding, minimum funding guarantee, but as I say, we're anticipating that the those areas will be similar. What's set out in that government funding document will be similar to the previous year, so those decisions will be similar decisions. And then in terms of the schools and central services block, as I say, appendix 5 sets out the amounts and decisions for that were made last year on those areas. So yeah, just any kind of an initial feedback. Page 43. Yeah, sorry, page 43. That is so the final appendix of the report. So yeah, any initial feedback on those decisions and forums thought. Jeremy?
Yeah, just maybe less of a thought about education functions, more about dedelegation. Just historically for the last couple of years, I've been an advocate for this myself. So it's just, the increases we're making to trade unions, free school eligibility contingencies, these sort of things, behavior support services, all of which I support. I just think that, with budgets going the way they are historically, I mean, obviously things could change as things have changed recently, but I think that the assumption that is made for schools in terms of what schools should have budgeted for and then what's being given to schools, for example, with salaries. So I think last year we were assumed to have predicted a 3% rise, and then it went to 6 or 5, and so we had to make up the difference. I think when we're calculating these numbers, I think that's the way maybe we should be looking at it, is that the services should have anticipated an amount that was going to be required, and that the forum's job is to top some of that up. I don't know if it applies in the same way, but I think there's just something about it that, you know, my own budget needed to account for a certain expectation, and then I'm topped up, and I'm just mindful of whether or not we apply a similar philosophy to some of the services here, or not.
I think that's helpful feedback. So I think the key for us to understand is particularly any areas where schools want to take a different direction, because we need to understand whether the consultation needs to reflect something kind of more radical. Do schools no longer want to have a dedelegated service but want to have something traded? Do you want a significantly increased scale of service? And so those types of things, and if anything like that, really helpful to understand early on. Otherwise, we may consult on something that ultimately doesn't reflect what schools want, and we have to go back out again. I think on the point around kind of pay inflation, what I would say is these services are very small and they fund quite a small number of posts. And so in our broader budgets, you know, which are council budgets that are either de-delegated from schools or funded from schools top slice, they're quite specific duties, and there isn't kind of cross-funding that we're able to access around that. So we'd need to find ways of shaving costs down, which is challenging when you're talking about maybe one person that covers the whole of a thing. And so I think that's the tricky bit around kind of that balance of accounting for the inflation and the total cost of a service at a kind of de minimis level that reflects the scale of service that needs for it to exist at all. You end up in the territory of, well, we can't really deliver the thing, so perhaps we don't deliver it and schools manage it themselves. So I know that sounds quite radical, but that's kind of the far end of the scale where that could go.
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, you understand the intricacies and the size and scale of these far better than I do. I guess I think that what you've just said makes complete sense to me, but I think that's what schools feel too, right? Is that, yes, I might have 25 teachers or 30 teachers, and shaving a bit here, expecting that is very different than if it's one person delivering a service, and I agree with that. But the number of services that our schools have all had to cut, shave, change, eliminate over the last decade is considerable. And I'm not suggesting that hasn't also happened here, because I know over the years we have seen, you know, massive changes in education functions, and so I'm not suggesting that hasn't happened. I don't want to come across as that, but I just think in principle, if we're talking about, you know, an 8% rise because of X, Y, and Z, I just think we need to be mindful maybe of some of these things too, because schools feel that exact same pressure.
Chairman?
Just very briefly as well, so we've previously stuck quite closely to the national funding formula as far as affordability allows, and we've also, in doing so, we've agreed to set the lowest minimum funding guarantee that the funding regulations allow for. Is that still broadly the position of Forum?
Yeah. So there will be in the consultation questions about dedelegation, the principles of the architecture around it.
There will be questions about the services to delegate and not, because there are some services we currently don't delegate, and there'll be questions around the principles of funding, say pay inflation or other aspects of it, which schools can respond to, and there are varying views as we see through the consultation responses in previous years.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to early years. We didn't have to, yeah, we've given our feedback on delegation and delegated skills grant.
Sorry, can I also ask, and I don't want a big, huge make work project for anybody, but some of the de-delegated services, the there is an amount sometimes that the forum is funding, and then there's an amount that comes from elsewhere. And sometimes that's confusing. So I'm wondering if in some of those circumstances, and I know I don't, again, I'm not trying to create a big thesis for somebody to put together, but just maybe trying to understand some of that, because it's hard to make a decision about some of the things I've just discussed when it's unclear, like, you know, if the forum is funding 10% of that service's budget and 90% is coming from the local authority or from ELP or from somewhere else, it makes it challenging to do that. Whereas if we're funding 90% of the budget, well, that's a different. And so I'm just wondering if some of that maybe just really, you know, bullet pointy, simply can just be understood, just so that that conversation can be, you know, meaningful. Is that all right?
Yeah, because for example, the behaviour support services, that's the outreach that we're funding. So the dual role placements and the other part of the Ealing Primary Centre is funded in another bit. But this dedelegation here is just for the outreach, and that's 100% funded by this dedelegation. So there isn't any other budget to account for staffing increases. So like you could argue with behaviour support services that that Forum would be minded to agree to fund all of it. But I get what you're saying. If there's another thing that's 75% funded by something else, 25% funded by us, is there to have that distinction might make head teachers more aware, because I think the average head teacher probably isn't aware of these. Yeah.
But I suppose
Yeah, we can pick that up in the consultation.
The counterbalance to that is, and it's an interesting point, is there could be a landscape in which Forum agrees not to delegate behaviour support services. It becomes a traded service. So that's the kind of clarity that I think. But correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the purpose of Schools Forum is to consult and advise and make some decisions on the dedicated schools grant. It's not. There's no council money outside of that grant. So
no, so there isn't. So anything outside of your
DSG.
immediate decisions around these top slices, it either falls into the, you know, one of the 4 blocks essentially. Yeah. And so, for example, something like behaviour support and outreach, it can be funded by dedelegation. It can also be funded directly by schools from traded services, and there are elements of outreach which are funded from the central pot of high needs. So there are a combination of things.
The issue is the council.
No, the council doesn't fund any of it. The only bits that the council funds are the statutory assessment services, such as the SENAS service. So those are council statutory services. They're not funded from the DSG. Yeah. But everything in an EHCP and all of the provision and support and SEND support that sits around it is either funded by schools or from the high needs block.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
In terms, sorry, Paul, is it all right to, sorry, I just jumped in. In terms of dedelegated services, is there a thought around strategy with SEND? Because right now that is a you know, agreement between schools, or there is an option to, you know, buy in some supports, traded that service with the school. Would there not be, with the increasing number of SEND situations in schools, would there be place for there to be a delegated SEND outreach service that's funded through this mechanism?
So there's a limited number of things within the funding guidance that can actually be de-delegated, and that's not, so the behaviour support services are one of them, but other aspects of SEND outreach aren't within that. So this part, I guess, some of the SEND outreach that does come from the high needs block is funded through the 0.5% transfer. So there is an element of that decision making, if you see what I mean, already happening in terms of a decision around de-delegating to a central pot, but it's through that mechanism, not through de-delegation.
It's an important point about the strategy, and Aretha's here to cover some kind of brief updates around it. Essentially, the local offer and the provision in the round needs to be considered in terms of what outcomes are we seeking to achieve for our young people, and then how are we going to fund it doesn't always come first. And so I think if there are if there's an appetite from schools to increase delegation, decrease it, move to a traded service, think about what the high needs block funds, that's all on the table, but it has to be done through the lens of the SEND strategy and developed, co-produced, and then options come back here for consideration. And I think that's the bit that we haven't been able to make quite as much progress as we might have hoped around collectively. And so that's part of what Aretha will cover, but I think that will need to develop quite quickly over time. We've got a high needs deficit, and a key aspect of recovering from that position is early intervention, of which outreach is a core part.
But in financial terms, we are just cutting and dicing the same lot of money, aren't we? I mean, there isn't more money, however we look at it. It's just different ways of divvying out the money to deliver the services that are required, if I understand it correctly. Perhaps I'm wrong.
It's all the same pot. You know, we allocate money to schools, schools spend the money on outreach. We delegate it, the school money hasn't gone to schools, and we're spending it on the outreach you're asking us to provide, or it's in the high needs block. It's all the same money, but early intervention does enable you to spend less later on. So the total spend should come down if the early intervention is great. And so it has to be delivered on an investor save basis, and there has to be clear evidence about how and where and why we're investing in certain aspects of the system as a whole, and evaluating that and constantly coming back to it. And that's what allows you to invest in some of those aspects that are more.
Given we've already started the conversation, Aretha, do you want to do the high needs update now, and then we'll come back to the early years update? That makes sense.
Hi everyone. So yeah, so the ask for the high needs block is for the ELA to recommend form notes the forecasting demand, the work that we've done in relation to sufficiency to address some of the demands of rising HCPs, which you've already alluded to, and rising SEND needs, to look at the deficit in the high needs block, which currently is 2.2 million, and provide feedback as to whether or not the form would recommend to continue the existing 0.5 transfer to the high needs block. I'll pause there and then I'll go on.
Any questions about the high needs block? Which is I mean, we're sort of running to standstill type thing, and that's being optimistic.
At the moment, I guess, but we can't because I think we're at the max.
I mean, in an ideal world, the issue around high needs is what is going to produce the most effective and most powerful outcomes as invest to save. And there may, you know, everything's up for grabs. It may be that the schools community don't feel outreach is the best approach. There could be another approach. You know, it's I kind of, I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, a good example of where there was some traction was where I remember about a year or two ago, there was some work done on annual review processes, and that saved $1 million or $1.5 million quid. Now, exponentially, the high needs, pressure on high needs goes on and on, but that was a classic example of where you can save. And I suppose we collectively have to decide, how do we divvy up the money with the most impact? And it's not an easy formula to.
So just to follow up from what Tamara was saying in terms of the priorities and SEND strategy. So where we're at the moment is really pushing that down into early intervention, as Tamara said, is the invest to save model, with the hope that if we get in early enough, we'll stop things from escalating further up the chain. So one of the key drivers and the key areas of work that we're developing is, yes, the early help part in terms of the early help strategy for social care, for NHS and for schools, but really also looking at early years, because we've identified that actually if you don't get that data right, we don't really understand what's happening there, actually that ripple effect is going to be continue exponentially. So one of the things that we're looking at doing is making sure that that provision is secure, the identification there is secure, which then will hopefully enable us to get in at the very earliest points. And with the wraparound services that are coming on stream from 9 months, with some schools taking that on board, actually there's a real opportunity to get that identification moving really quickly. But as a system, we have to be prepared for that. And some of the other services also need to be prepared for what that might flag up, for example, with additional diagnostics, etc., etc. So we're working as a unit to flesh that out.
I do think, just to follow on what Aretha is saying, this is not a forum for a SEND discussion at this level, but I think it's worth noting that there could be a bit of there's always a potential for radical approaches to this. And the reason why I mention that is because many colleagues around this table, coming from different viewpoints, would agree to greater or lesser extent that teaching is about teaching. It's not about assessment. And assessment in some cases is overtaken teaching, and teachers and staff should be teaching. And equally, I apply that principle to SEND. The early identification is really important, but the multidisciplinary assessments around SEND are out of control and are absorbing resources that are bearing down heavily on the high needs budget. And what we should be doing is teaching in its broadest sense. We should, if we're talking about early intervention, we should be teaching the skills to, I feel like I'm on a lecture here, we should be teaching the skills to effect change. And what we're doing is, and I know this is blithe to say, is all we're doing is assessing. And that's very frustrating. And I'm sure you guys are as frustrated by that as we are.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the national picture in terms of what we're seeing in terms of EPs and speech and language and all of the pressures there. And that's why that early intervention bit is so important. Because if we can get some of that intervention going, the diagnostic bit, that, to be fair, schools do the work without the diagnostic coming through, without the diagnosis. So we're already there doing that work. The other bit is looking at the workforce, which Madhu's leading, in terms of making sure actually there is enough training and support for the practitioners who are delivering some of that work. Because as I said, if we start to identify early and we start to intervene with the right things early on, and we start to share that best practice around, then hopefully, sounds a bit blue skyish, but hopefully we'll get to a position where we're seeing a bit of a reduction and a bit of the pressure ease off. Who knows what's coming with the, we've got a SEND AP paper that may or may not roll through in the same format. So I think we are in a bit of a holding game, whether we like it or not. But certainly in the next 3 years, I don't see much shifting from our projections.
Jeremy, were you going to say something? No.
No, I mean, I think I was just agreeing with you, because I think that's at the core of it, whether it sounds like A or sounds like B, like that's what I think what we're all talking about, right? Is this idea that, well, yeah, we've got this incredible SEMH behavior outreach service, which is highly effective, but we also need this kind of outreach, support, training, development, and worked with Madhu, for a long time, and I think that, yeah, running courses, teaching skills is great, but there, people are out a lot, and we need support on the ground in the school. Send someone on a course, they come back, I learned a bit about autism, I learned a bit of this, well, great, but it needs to be in situ, which is one of the great things about the work that John's team does. And I think whether it's through dedelegation, which obviously is maybe not fitting the criteria, or through another mechanism, it's about, I think, harnessing the expertise and the talent that already exists within a partnership of schools and creating a collaborative model whereby we're all learning, growing, and developing, and creating the places that we need where learning, growth, and development isn't going to be enough, where we need something slightly different. And Aretha, it's the first time we've met, you've been here. Welcome. And it's really great, really great to hear you speaking about this, because for a million and one reasons for the last number of months, there's been transition in this space, and to hear this confidence and this clarity is lovely. So welcome.
Thank you. Just last but one point.
Yeah, I just wanted to shout out the early years specialist team, because that's exactly what they do. They come in, they give practical advice, on the ground, and they've gone into a number of schools, haven't they? And including mine, and it's been really effective. So that there is already some really great practice happening there that could maybe be scaled up or brought into different things other than reception and nursery classes.
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm hoping to drive is that partnership working and actually figuring out all the bits of the jigsaw and trying to get a thread through. So we're actually working and all facing in the same direction for the benefit of our pupils with SEND. But yeah, I mean, here where we are. I think we're at a good point to have a conversation around things like outreach and what it needs to look like, and that will be through the SEND strategy. So I think my ask to you would be to you know, come get involved really and be part of that process.
Yeah, so before we move on to the early years, I just wanted to come to the bit about the deficit. So as I said, we are now in a deficit in the high needs block, which is not a position. So last year we had a small deficit on the high needs block, but it was offset by smaller deficits in the other blocks. We're now in a position where that high needs block deficit has grown, and so we're now in an overall deficit on the just under 2 million on the DSG, which does mean that we will be under greater scrutiny. So it's a position that a large number of authorities are already in, and some under great scrutiny through safety valve and the other one, delivering better value. So we're not in one of those programs and are unlikely to move into one of those programs, but we will, with the deficit as it currently is, but we will have a greater scrutiny from that. So we will be required to provide information on our high needs recovery plans to the or our deficit management plan, I think they call it, rather than recovery these days. But so to the ESFA, so we'll have a meeting with the ESFA in the autumn term to talk through that. So we will bring further sort of information to the November forum in terms of the information we've presented to the ESFA on that.
Can I just ask, does a deficit recovery plan, is it included, or is it relevant to include it in the SEND strategy? Because I haven't seen any evidence so far of deficit recovery.
It's just being really mindful about how we word it, and because it's flagged up. The issue of the SEND strategy is that it was just recently redrafted, so actually putting it in the SEND strategy itself might be a bit tricky, but we can put it in the action plan in terms of just tweaking that slightly.
And I think what we sort of discussed last time is that the SEND strategy sort of is the deficit recovery plan, if that makes sense. That actually the actions in the SEND strategy are the things that will support us in managing the deficit moving forward.
I think that's a really good way of positioning it. But I think if it was that kind of tagline was made, I'm not saying that you tag the SEND strategy as the recovery plan, but that this helps us to manage pressures going forward.
And that's a long term. Yeah, it goes up to 27. I think the plan needs a bit of tweaking and a bit of adjusting, and so through that process we'll be able to add in some elements of things that will enable that trajectory to slow.
Okay, so if I go back to recommendation 6, are my numbers right? 5, around the update from early years. So just briefly, section 3.5 is a brief update on the early years block. So there's some information on the funding arrangements that were agreed for the current financial year. The early summer headcounts are sort of consistent with headcounts in the spring term, in line with expectations. The working parent offer, which was the bit that came into play in April, we've seen 805 funding claims so far, which is in line with the sort of initial DfE estimates of 881 that we were working with, expecting those headcounts to continue to increase in summer and autumn as that kind of offer and gets embedded. And so yeah, continuing to monitor those headcounts. There's a contingency in place to help with, which they've agreed to help with, ensure there's adequate funding to cope with those kind of variations in headcount and the sort of challenges of the new provisions coming in. Updates to the funding allocations will be published in kind of late summer, and then September we'll see the introduction of the working parent offer for under 2-year-olds. So that's the kind of next bit of the childcare reforms coming through. One of the conversations we had at the last meeting was around the childcare sufficiency assessment. So not to go into sort of like, because we discussed it's not really a kind of a matter for forum, but as an information point, Ealing's childcare sufficiency assessment has been completed and published. There's a link in the report to the childcare sufficiency assessment and some of the kind of priorities and areas of indicated within that around the gaps in sufficiency as the offer increases to 30 hours from September 25, particularly in the under 2 age group, particularly in Southall, Greenford and Acton. So those being kind of key planning focus. To date, the kind of engagement with schools has indicated that the focus of schools to date has been around extending the 30-hour and the wraparound offer, but those sort of conversations will, around the other parts of the offer will be ongoing. You'll have noted in the government's, so in our new government's manifesto, the pledge around the repurposing or the sort of intention around exploring repurposing unused space in primary schools as a key route for developing additional childcare places, both run through schools and potentially run through PVI providers. So obviously there's various calls on that space, and we're obviously looking at that space in terms of SEND provision as well. But I think that's a key manifesto pledge from the new governments. Is something that we're likely to explore and can update forum further on moving forward. And for schools who want to have those conversations about developing their early years model, Leah, whose surname I can't remember, double-barrel surname, in the early years team is the person who can have those conversations with the with schools. Is there any questions on the early years bit?
Any further capital money being invested into this at all, into schools or local authorities? Because there are schools who would love to have more younger children and increase that offer for the community, but you know, I have no space. And so can we treat it like a bulge and, you know?
Yeah, so there has been a capital allocation, but in reality, it will fund small grants to providers. It's not going to build new provision. So it will be making a contribution to enabling a provider to convert an existing space into an early years kind of playroom or whatever. And given the manifesto pledge and the position of the government around existing surplus accommodation, I'd imagine that wouldn't be an immediate priority in terms of ramping up the capital investment around that until it becomes apparent that sufficiency can't keep up with demand. And so I think what we're keen to speak to schools about is where there is accommodation available. And for some schools, even where, schools have reduced in size but have converted the space into specialist art rooms, various other things, those spaces are available to move back into early years provision. And so those are some of the difficult decisions that some school leaders are thinking about. So yeah, that's the current position on capital.
Okay, so moving into the final recommendations. So the final two recommendations are to note the DSG outturns and to agree the recommendation to retain the 23-24 DSG reserves for expected high needs deficits, commitments against the growth fund and other pressures related to future organisation changes. So that's a continuation of the position that Forum have agreed in previous years. I think we've already kind of covered the conversation about the DSG outturns, but they're set out in the financial section 4 of the report. In terms of the reserves, so there are small, so the high needs block deficit is just over 2 million at the end of March 24. The schools block, CSS block and early years block have small surpluses on them, which are partly related to previous kind of underspends of historic unused contingencies in schools block terms. The sort of contingency, unused contingency, and managing the kind of flow of uncertainty around grants in the early years block and sort of timing of expenditure in the CSS block. So the ask for forum is to consider that those underspends, are carried forward against the blocks into the new financial year. So the ask for forum is to consider and agree the local authority recommendation that those underspends are retained and used for, as I say, those pressures around high needs, commitments against the growth fund where those outstrip the allocations there, and potentially other pressures around school organisation.
So can I just ask before we move on to agreement, at a macro level, and as much as there's been very helpful discussion this evening about schools monitoring their budgets, is it possible to monitor and project where the high needs budget is going, like next year? Like, is there a trajectory?
So yeah, we can cover that. So part of the ESFA's expectation, and also what we would be doing anyway, is actually projecting the high needs block much further into the future, so 3 to 5 years. So thinking about demand, need, provision available, and costing that up. Okay. So yes, that's a work in progress. We're not there yet with it. We've got quite high level, broad brush kind of understanding. I think the scale of the scale of costs and spend we're talking about, it gives you a good sense of the direction of travel, but we need to get to a much more granular level as part of the deficit, not recovery, deficit management planning. And that's something that we would be keen to be bringing back to forum at a reasonable level of detail, kind of summarised, to demonstrate that collective grip around the deficit and the steps to, because ultimately the steps are both local authority steps, but across the partnership, across schools, across health, across the blocks, because there's quite a lot of investment into SEND from the early years block as well. Yes. Great.
So I think,
I had a quick question. Could we have an update on the year 11 that comes from, where did the year 11 money come from? Thank you.
Yeah, so for the year 11 placements, so we were talking about the year 11s that moved in or new to Borough, they're going off to West Thames College, I believe. So the consultation went out to schools, I think, about 3 weeks ago. So we've got the responses in. So we're just going through the responses, looking at the evidence that's required to then come back to some of those responses and some of the comments in there. And we are going back to colleges to just find out a little bit more about their offer for things like, assessment of SEND needs, that sort of thing, and what that looks like in reality. So when are we hoping to? I don't have the detail on that.
So progress is being made in consulting with the high school heads to get the detail, and the detail from the colleges about the cohorts and the actual provision that would enable them to achieve great outcomes. It may not be fully concluded by the autumn meeting, but we'll be able to provide an update on where we're at with it, and it will need to form part of our commissioning and our budget setting. So it has to be resolved so that schools can respond and we can do that before the end of this financial year. So there's a kind of clear timeline around.
Question really about the STEM budget getting. Is that because STEM requires TA support funding? Is it because we're going aimed in use because we haven't got vision to hire?
I mean, it's a combination of factors. So that demand is increasing at a level that's greater. So the number of EHCPs is increasing at a level that's greater than the rate of increase in the block funding. That the pressures around the independent sector and the cost of that provision are a key part of that.
That's not going to go away until we invest, and we can't invest until we're allowed to invest or funded to invest.
So I think There's a significant amount of investment. We've got a capital delivery plan around the development of specialist places that extends to 2030, and that seeks to address some of those challenges and has the potential of reducing our call on the non-maintained initiative. But also collectively, we need to do the basics really well. Paul referred to annual review project that was delivered previously. That's part of the statutory process that we all have to follow. Transition planning and making sure we're buying the right provision that supports a child's needs at a point in time, and that is reviewed and updated, you know, is a core principle, because at the moment we're agreeing things at the point of escalation and crisis. And so you guys receive funding which doesn't necessarily reflect the needs of a child at a point in time. Sometimes that goes up, sometimes that should be coming down. And so along with the SEND strategy, that also needs to be addressed, because those are the types of things that the ESFA would be expecting us to do well in the situation where there's a deficit. We have to be spending the money that we have really well, and we could collectively be doing kind of differently in some of those spaces.
I don't think anyone would disagree that we should be doing those administrative functions better, but surely the major cost is the cost of staffing the facilities that we need to have in place. And if we don't get pay reviews funded, the problem gets worse and worse and worse every year until it is properly funded. Or
I mean, it's
provide a
definitely,
substandard education.
I think you're hitting on the one of the main challenges that's beyond every local authority's control, and it'll be interesting. I know, but it'll be interesting to see, you know, whether SEND takes centre stage in this new government's, because it's affecting every school, it's affecting staffing, it's affecting morale, it's affecting, you know, it's one of the biggest pressures in schools at the moment, and, you know, it's been kicked into the long grass.
Yeah. And you talk about getting the early elements right, because otherwise the education system will be paying for it for the next 10 years, and adult services will be paying it for the next 50 or 60 years. And so somebody needs to get to grips with it in government, and soon.
Sorry, I don't mean to belabor this. Emma's question, I think I maybe missed the answer to that question about the year 11 money. Where is the money coming from?
Oh, I think we were clear about that last time. It's funded from the high needs block.
And so, I mean, can I just be clear then that if it's coming from the high needs block, all schools, primaries and secondaries, are funding this, right?
Well, it's coming from the block. There's no part of the block that's designated for a particular phase, so it's coming from the block. If there are elements where there's a clear case to continue some form of alternative provision for a cohort, that would still be funded from the high needs block.
Yeah.
But any adjustment to the provision available for those young people may result in a reduction in the level of spending for that cohort. So that's where a reduction in spend would also be showing.
Okay.
You're right, it's coming from the high needs block, which is available
to all schools.
It's available to all schools, but it's not the equivalent of a dedelegation where sectors of you know, you're calculating it on a per pupil rate. The high needs block is not managed in that way.
No, I understand, but if there was £100 available and now there's only 60, that matters.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's part of the discussion that we had last time, which is why we brought it to the attention of Forum, that for all Forum members, not just in a conversation separately with high school heads. So that's why it's coming here, and it's important that the needs of that cohort are carefully considered, and we are commissioning the right type of provision, and that may be through
from a SEND perspective. Right?
From a SEND perspective, because it is AP, but where they can have their needs met in mainstream and mainstream schools, that's where they can be placed, and that's the discussion that's happening.
Okay.
For a proportion of those children.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to all our online colleagues. You're now free. School is out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You